Okay. So it looks like we're streaming now, which is awesome. So welcome everyone to, this is our third diversity and inclusion call. This specific call is all things code of conduct. We've had a lot of interest in a lot of topics, but none more than this, none more than making our governance and code of conduct real and understood and trusted in our events and communities and projects. And on our panel today, I'm so excited to have a number of, oops, sorry, I'm just looking at my screen, a number of people with expertise in this area and diverse expertise. In order of my wiki page, we have Sage Sharp, who we've had the honor of working with at Mozilla before, who is a diversity and inclusion consultant at Otter Tech, an outreachy organizer, which is a fantastic organization. And welcome, Sage. We also have Brian, and Brian, I should have confirmed how to say your name in advance, Exelibert. My Canadian accent might not do that justice, who works as a Fedora community coordinator and has a background in higher education and IT and engineering. Welcome, Brian. Rachel, who works as the community liaison of the Drupal Association. We're really glad to see Drupal on this call. Thanks for joining us, Rachel.
It's good fun.
Kate Mancuso, who works at Mozilla as a community participation guidelines lead. Kate has a background in crisis response and project management, is really helping us build effective processes at Mozilla. Thanks for joining us, Kate.
Hi, everybody.
And last but not least, Coraline, we're so excited to have the creator of the Contributor Covenant, which has been adopted by over 40,000 open source projects. That number is correct. And is a Rubius speaker, writer, and podcaster. So an amazing group of people here today. And just thank you again for being here. And so the format of this call is we have 4 questions, which we, are hopefully open enough that people can respond thoughtfully about their own work. And I'm going to try and time them a little bit for about 8 minutes to take up about 40% of the call, and then to make room for questions from all of you on the call. So before I get started, I just want to say again, if you're joining this call, please add your name, your Twitter handle if you wish, and your pronouns. And just a reminder to, if you are addressing someone, to use the pronouns that they've described in the Etherpad. And again, there's if you want help with anything, you want to share links, you're interested in helping other people, there's places for that. Okay, so moving forward, knowing that we'll have lots of great discussion, I'm going to ask the first question. And that question is, what would you say have been the biggest challenges in enforcing your project's code of conduct, and why do you think that is? And of course, you can replace the word project with your events or your experience. So as far as who wants to go first, I'll maybe just start. Rachel, you're on the furthest left of my screen, so maybe I'll start with you.
Okay, so whilst I used to be involved in the Drupal community code of conduct, I'm not anymore. I'm not part of the CWG. But I am responsible for our code of conduct at the DrupalCon events, and one that just took place in Nashville. So I'm going to base everything upon that because it's probably easier. The thing that I genuinely find most difficult and makes my life as somebody who enforces the code of conduct are third parties. When an event happens, so someone brings something to our attention, maybe via online or whatever, that's fine, we can deal with that. What we find really difficult is then, and it happens not just within tech world, but generally without, it seems that lots of people feel they need to give an opinion, either questioning the original person's issue or supporting that issue, but doing that very publicly, usual social media type things. Do you know what? That actually makes it always, without fail, always makes the situation more difficult. It doesn't help. I can't think of any occasion in all the things I've dealt with where that's actually been helpful. I really wish people would let the original person who's complained about something talk. Let's actually get together, deal with that situation, and we can do something. But all of the piling on, as I might describe it from school days, is only ever unhelpful. I find that really difficult.
Yeah. Sage, do you have anything to add there, or any interesting thoughts?
Let's see. So with the online thing, sometimes people do want to let their network know about what happened, and so I think it's still valid to do that. But then also there's the people who want to give an opinion one way or the other about the call. I think what I find most difficult for the challenges that I see in various communities are actually dealing with borderline cases of persistent low-level abrasiveness or harassment in their communities, and deciding, where the line is, how many incidents have to occur before someone who is maybe more of a blunter personality, how much that's impacting the community. The other things I see too is that there are a lot of communities that are adopting a code of conduct, but they don't necessarily think through all of the implications of what adopting a code of conduct means. And so when an incident occurs, they're not prepared for it. They don't have an incident response plan in place. They haven't thought about how to deal with conflicts of interest within their enforcement team. And so until they actually start the enforcement, then there's a lot of issues that they don't think about that they need to work out.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of that as, people put code of conducts up, and that seems like the work done until somebody actually tries to enact it. Coraline?
I would echo what Sage said. We have a lot of tools now to make it very easy to adopt a code of conduct for an open source project. There's a workflow built into GitHub, which I actually built while I was at GitHub. And the contributor covenant makes it really easy. There's even an NPM tool, and the bundler project, which is how libraries are created in a Ruby community, has an option to add a code of conduct to your project. So to echo what Sage said, I think a lot of people naively think that adding the code of conduct is all they need to do to make their project or community welcoming and inclusive and diverse. What they don't realize is that all the code of conduct is, it has two functions. One is it's a signal to marginalized people in tech that this is a place that is intended to be safe. But the second thing, as Sage said, is you have to be prepared for enforcement. And if you haven't given thought to how you're going to deal with incidents, then you're sending a false signal to very vulnerable people about the experience they're going to have. What I typically tell people who ask me about welcoming open source projects is the code of conduct is just table stakes, right? If it doesn't have a code of conduct, don't bother. But don't take the presence of a code of conduct as an indication of safety. Look at how issues are being responded to. Look at the kinds of communication that are happening when issues or pull requests come into play. Look at not only how the person or the people in charge of the project are communicating, but also how members of the community are communicating with themselves. Those are all really important considerations beyond just the signaling.
That was excellent. As I was listening to you, I'm wondering, why do you think it is that is it are people just thinking they'll deal with that later, or what kind of reasons have you seen why, like, the code of conducts are half enforced or partially enforced? Is it just an apathy to it, or it just feels like something they'll get to later? Have you seen any?
I think that people don't understand the level of responsibility that they're taking on necessarily, not really giving it any thought. And there's also a a fear factor involved. I've seen this with a lot of larger projects going through the process of adopting a code of conduct, where criticism of the process usually falls into a few different categories. The one that's most relevant now is people saying, well, I'm afraid that the people who are responsible for enforcing are going to overreach. And I think there's a fear of overreach and over-enforcement that may, in some cases, ironically cause people to not react when they should.
It's interesting. Brian, do you have any thing to add here?
No, what Fedora is currently found to be its largest issues have already been mentioned by other panelists. To kind of address your second question, I think that another factor that comes up is that when you are working with the initial adoption of the code of conduct, it feels very obvious what this is going to mean and how you're going to apply it. And then when there is an incident, especially a serious incident, the heat of that incident causes you to begin to either second guess yourself or to realize you didn't actually think through what you're going to do when these kinds of things happen. And I know one of the challenges that we've been facing is that we're trying to write a more comprehensive guide for reaction that can cover more of a broad range. And there are not many examples of that out there. And so I'm hoping that as all of our communities continue to mature, we will become able to more openly publish our incident response guides so that people can look at how other communities chose to literally say, this is how we do an investigation. This way, I can say, that may not be the right method for my community, but I can adopt and adapt in an open source way.
Right. And so, Brian, you should actually look at the PyCon code of conduct that I just did a bunch of work on to add to their incident response guide and then also their attendee reporting guide as well, which may not apply to online communities, but may apply more to your events.
Right. Yeah. It's one of the many codes of conducts and components that we're distilling into this document.
That would be good to share out after. There's a question, and I think maybe it's a good one to ask right now, is I think related to something Coraline said about how can one observe when coming to a new community how incident reports are being dealt with. I hear the responses should also be protect the victim's privacy. Sorry, I'm stumbling over that, and or not. So there's like this balance, like how do we understand how the community is responding to violations, but how do we also protect like the people in those incidents? Like what is the visibility of a process look like for code of conduct? I don't know, Kate, or I won't call on anyone specifically, but it seems like a good question.
Sure, I'm happy to take that one. So a lot of the visibility of the process is important, and I'll say, to be quite transparent, we're still working on this for Mozilla, is just having the process to some degree written out, what people can expect when they report in terms of time, and who they're reporting to is actually pretty important, because you want to have a system that if someone needs to report on someone who is on the committee, that's clear. So you can do that in a number of ways, either by putting people's names out, but if that makes them vulnerable to doxing, you could have a form where that reaches one person and puts kind of who they don't want, who the person doesn't want this shared with. But I would say overall, it's just having it be clear that there is a reporting process. And I think most marginalized people are looking for that, because if you just have a code of conduct, it's just a piece of paper.
Yeah, absolutely. So after DrupalCon this year, I created a report not only of how many code of conduct issues that we had, but actually what they were and what we did about them, and also, you know, what happens next, if anything, and any lessons learned, etc. So how we might change the process for the next DrupalCon. We also included a link to a survey to ask for feedback on what people felt about how the code of conduct was presented to them this year and what effect that had upon them. That was done and sent by email to every participant at DrupalCon within days of it finishing. And that made a big difference. certainly judging by the results on the survey in terms of what people felt the effect that the code of conduct had. So I'm quite pleased that we did that. It took a lot of putting together, but it was worth doing because people can see not only this is my process, but they can see this is actually the fact that we followed it. And that's a difference.
Right. And Rachel, could you put a link to that transparency report in the Etherpad?
Yeah, that would be great.
I need to check whether we're happy to do that as opposed to just sending it to attendees at the moment. But yes, I will do if I can. Yeah. Okay,
that would be great.
I think it's important to acknowledge too that that level of visibility can prevent. Well, I want to first of all acknowledge that there is a whisper network among marginalized people in tech and in open source. And we do talk about our experiences, and we will share our negative experiences of an event or of a community. And doing the sort of the transparency that Rachel's describing about how incidents were handled can sort of reinforce the reputation of a conference or a community in a positive way. Whereas if reports seem to disappear into the ether, you're more likely to have some damage done to your reputation that's going to affect participation in the future.
Absolutely. And I mean, we're talking about people, you have to make sure that everybody's happy with it and so on, and sending that people aren't going to be upset by the report. But yeah, it's worth doing. It makes a big difference. And also, doing the survey, Mozilla produced this sort of survey template that they have on GitHub, which I'm sure Emma can post a link to. We used that survey almost exactly as it was, and it's really helpful because now we've got something that we can benchmark against next year, and we can benchmark against other events, which is useful. The results were quite shocking, actually.
I'm so excited that you used that template, and also that you can contribute to in making it a better set of questions, right? So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that helped you, or what you would do differently or ask differently next time. Great. So I'm going to jump to question 4 because I think we're a little bit touching on decision making and bias. And so question 4 was, and I think most people might have heard this, the white paper around the cost of bullying, which states that the cost of keeping a high-performing worker who also happens to be toxic can cost as much as $100,000 per target year. So the cost of keeping someone like this is far more expensive than the cost of addressing and maybe terminating them in the HR world. And I think that in open source communities, there's also the perception that someone who's highly productive or who's been part of a community for a long time should be regarded differently. And I think we've seen that play out in some communities before. And so my question is, how have you or your project dealt with bias and decision-making towards these sort of more notable or popular, whatever word you want to use, personas? And what would you advise maybe even to others that would face that?
Can I sort of frame that a little bit before we get into specifics?
Yeah.
I think that, one of the 4 pillars of open source is meritocracy. And I think that meritocracy does a very poor job of accommodation for marginalized people. It's the idea that it doesn't matter who you are or what you do, only your code contributions matter. And I think that that particular pillar, a lot of us see problems with a meritocratic system favoring the privileged. And this is exactly where the rubber hits the road in terms of how do you deal with a high performing toxic person? And I don't think you can talk about that without talking about the vestiges of meritocracy in open source.
Yeah.
I think as well that we need to talk about how we define someone who's high performing, which is generally someone who's technical in the open source world, right? And so there's this thought that we need to keep this high performing person, but underlying that is the assumption that they're technical, right? And not a documentation person or a graphics designer, I want to also call out that assumption as well.
Yeah, that comes down to the definition of merit, right?
Right.
Which is very fuzzy, and which is part of the problem of a meritocracy.
These are great points. So what advice would you give, or would anyone have for someone in this situation, or that they've learned themselves? If it's possible yet to give that type of advice, I don't know.
So we have thankfully not had a person who meets the definitions that have been talked about so far have a challenge in our community. However, we did have a long-term community member who, long-term contributor who had some challenges. And the end result of that process was that we asked this person to take some time off so that they could center themselves, figure out where they needed to be, et cetera. And one of the pieces of pushback that we got from that was that this person was an integral part of the technical delivery. This person happens to not be a coder, but it still was involved in the technical side of our project. And there was some pushback on that. And they were like, this puts severe jeopardy for this thing. And our response was, well, we've had the thrilling opportunity of identifying a single point of failure. And this is a great opportunity for us to evaluate how that component fits with the rest of our project, what we need to do to get more people up to speed, and to create an opportunity for new contributors to come in and do the work that this individual was doing, or assist this individual should they choose to return after their time out. And I think that it's important that we stop to separate the idea of, say, an HR process from some of our open source community processes, where our community's output may be something that a commercial entity is relying upon, but that does not force our community to meet that commercial entity's scheduling and goals. So if God forbid you miss a release for whatever reason because you have taken care of your community first and some commercial entity suffers, then that entity should have been a greater contributor to your project. And I feel like that's an important thing for us to keep in mind, that we are beholden to our communities first. And that gives us the opportunity to, look at these folks and work on our communities first.
And I think I want to echo something Brian said, was that a lot of the times with these people who are high performing people, they'll often be in charge of like a particular very critical system, or they'll have some tribal knowledge in their head. And sometimes that happens because like they're the person that built it. This is what they have. And then sometimes as well, people have an awareness that this is the place where I can have my power base, essentially, of this is my thing, I have control over it. And so people who have issues with control or issues with working with other folks, they often are find themselves in this role of, I have this thing, this is my power base, this is where I am. And so getting that knowledge out of their head and having them work with other people to try to have someone step into that place is going to be a difficult process, because these are the sorts of places that these people tend to go into. So it's really important to figure out, as Brian said, the long-term plan of getting that knowledge out of their head, having them not be the single point of failure. It's also important to note that people sometimes who become that single point of failure, either because of their personality or because of building this thing, often feel burnout around that. And so if you can perhaps approach them as, we want to help you with this burnout, we want to try to lift some of this burden off you and get other people trained, that might help as well.
I saw a discussion of this on Twitter, and one of the points that actually a lot of people made was you have a high-performing individual who may be keeping other people with the potential to be highly performing out by virtue of their personality or their abrasiveness, or, as Sage said, the power imbalance that's implicit in having them be part of the project. So I don't think it has to be treated as a zero-sum game where either you have a feature release that's going to go out because of this toxic person's contributions, or it just won't happen. And I really love the angle of succession planning as a way to motivate that person to relinquish some of that power.
Yeah, I want to second what Sage said about, I think the part that I hear there is taking a collaborative approach with the person, both in terms of succession planning and in terms of if they have been a highly productive contributor, it may be possible to find parameters under which they can still contribute to the project. Maybe they're not very good at user support, or maybe they shouldn't be commenting on bugs, but maybe they can still submit code patches. And maybe there's a way to get them to say, hey, I didn't handle this right. I think that sometimes we have an assumption that because someone is a great technical contributor, that they will also have the soft skills necessary to navigate the domain. And that's not always true. And I think sometimes it's okay to let people not have those soft skills. And sometimes we can coach people to have those skills.
Thanks, Kate. That was the one thing I think we've learned a little bit too, is that some people don't understand that what their intentions and what actually happened are not always the same thing, and being able to sit with them and explain like the consequences, or that just because they didn't intend something doesn't mean it didn't have real consequences. Like having some of those honest conversations have been helpful for us in the past. It depends on the person, but there's an education piece that if it's baked into the process can actually be pretty helpful.
Yeah, and it depends on the situation. Obviously, I should say there are some situations in which probably someone is making someone feel horribly unsafe, and then often the correct solution is for that person to go. But there are lots of situations in which contributors are getting on each other's nerves, or they're not communicating in the kindest way to each other. Sometimes we will have each of them report on the other. And that's the kind of situation that is often amenable to figuring out what people's strengths are and working with them to get them to contribute from their strengths.
One of the ways, there's been some research around this. One of the ways that you can kind of prevent that kind of escalation is it's so simple, but it actually has been shown to work, is to remind people that there's a certain level of decorum that's expected. So if you do have control over bug reporting, you're not doing bug reporting on GitHub, for example, if you can add a prompt that says, are you being kind and considerate? Here's a link to our code of conduct, or to our behavior guidelines, or to our contributing guide. That kind of prompting can have a huge effect on de-escalation.
Discourse actually has this prompt by default if folks want to sort of look at an example of a prompt.
Okay. Great. So another question is basically about the decision makers. So we, in our D&I for community survey, I would say some people, but a lot of people indicated that their belief in the code of conduct was either watered down with enforcement left to people who didn't really care about inclusion, or in some way, like stand to lose from enforcement. How do you think projects can ensure that those taking responsibility for enforcement are invested in inclusive outcomes? For example, some of the things I've seen come up are, should the project owner, and maybe like a big project versus like something small, also be the person responsible for enforcement, or should that be set up separately? Like, are there some best practices in setting up response, like non-biased response?
I think the questions, like, I'd like to turn around the questions, question the questions, if so. Yep, totally. So if people are saying, I feel like the code of conduct is watered down, I feel like it's not enforced, then, or the people who are going to enforce it are not involved in this inclusivity. To me, what that says is that the people don't feel like they have equity in the project leadership and the people who are working on the code of conduct. So my question is more around, how could you build up those leaders to go into those leadership positions, and so that people do feel like they have a stake in the game, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't want to force a project leader to step into enforcement if they're not going to be enthusiastic or responsive to people. So in general, if people don't want to get involved with enforcement, I would say not force them to. If they are hesitant because they're worried about, like, I don't know how to handle this, I don't have the skills can be taught. But if the curiosity and them wanting to do that's not there, I wouldn't force them to.
Yeah, there's definitely an education component. I'm glad you raised that, Sage. I think that typically we look to people who are affected. We look to underrepresented and marginalized people because they have the background or the understanding and the personal experience to know what enforcement should look like to preserve, for example, the safety of the reporter. It's things that we live with and that we're familiar with. And I think there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, those are the people that should be put in charge, which is additional unacknowledged emotional labor. So there's definitely an education component to it, but I don't think that's an excuse anymore because there's been so much writing on this topic. You're a Google search away from lots and lots of great resources. People just have to actually care about it.
Yeah, and I think that, as you said, the emotional labor piece is there, right? That we put this on people who have that experience, who have gone through a code of conduct report. And I feel like, especially in conference organizers are like, oh, well, we have that one person that they handle all of this, and so they think it's done, right? And so I would like to have more communities think about what is this emotional labor and how can we make sure that other people are spreading the burden around.
I'm going to take a question from the Etherpad now, which is a great one, I think. The question is, how are people in global communities addressing very different cultural realities in the context of code of conduct? In specific, for example, I was asked how we would handle it if we have a community in a country and the group's named in our guidelines as a protected group, which is not legal in the country. And I'm thinking a lot about this and wondering what others have done. I'm not sure who asked that question, but and the way that we've been thinking about this is what are the regional strategies that you can apply to your enforcement that take into consideration where people are in their regional strategies. Does anyone need that elaborated on a bit?
I mean, I don't think I have any regional strategy tips, but I do want to say that there have been various groups that have been targeted as illegal in various countries, even countries that they're no longer illegal anymore. And so I don't think that just because a particular country makes a human being illegal that we should change our response or how we support that person.
Yeah, I agree.
There's lots of or American centrism that comes up when projects are adopting codes of conduct, and people say, well, if someone is from a different country, they don't speak English as a first language, they're going to make mistakes. And of course, those situations will happen, but there are basic universally acknowledged human rights that are beyond borders. And those protected classes are protected for a reason across the world. And we have to acknowledge, I mean, if your open source project is based in the US, then there are definitely going to be some cultural influences there. It really comes down to deciding at the beginning and then enforcing over time and preserving over time what the cultural values of the project are. And people do need to adjust to that. If you have transphobic contributors who are from a country where transgender people don't have legal protection, that doesn't mean that they have license to be disrespectful to other transgender contributors. That is a cultural difference, but it comes down to the values that the project holds dear, and making sure that those values are not eroded over time as participation broadens.
That's a great answer. Does anyone else have thoughts on that?
We actually do deal with this a fair amount internally at Mozilla, and we don't really have a completely concrete solution on this issue in general. A lot of times, if there is a cultural issue that I don't understand, that I think might be playing in, I will consult an employee from that country who we know is aware of the issues. In a couple of cases, we have someone sort of who is paid to do this. In the cases of smaller countries, I might have to go within the company and look for a volunteer. But for instance, we have many Indian contributors, and India is many different things politically. And that's something that is tough for me to understand. So sometimes when a debate between two Indian contributors comes up, it's about a political issue, and I turn to someone who understands Indian politics to be clear about what is happening and what would be the best way forward to resolve.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I mean, for example, culturally, things are different. So at an event in Europe, in many parts of Europe, a conversation between people who know each other there might use terms and things between them that are they both see them as perfectly reasonable and wouldn't be a code of conduct issue because they're not upsetting each other, blah, 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 blah. But if they're overheard by someone from the US, absolutely that person from the US will or may well have an issue with that. And things are so much different between the two places. It's probably one of my biggest learnings, having started working for a US association or US-based association and spending more time there, is how people take offense at things so much more easily. And there's very much a case of think about where you are and think about, well, okay, if I'm in an international setting, i.e. I'm at an international conference, then you need to think internationally and adjust how you speak with each other if there's any chance of you might be overheard. Things are different in different parts of the world, and some things that are acceptable in one place are not acceptable elsewhere.
Yeah. I think we've definitely tried to be like our mission and being a part of the Mozilla community and our participation guidelines is the same globally. I mean, that's how we approach it. And but we're definitely open to helping people understand how to adjust and how other people might perceive things. And then that's it's an ongoing, learning is an ongoing thing. And I think that we're getting there, and people are starting to understand that if you say, well, that's not how we treat women here, or it's like, well, within the context of this community, that is actually how it is. So, and people have been more open to it over time. So I'm just, speaking of time, we have 15 minutes left. I'm looking at attendee questions here on the Etherpad. I'm going to take a couple more, and this one is more of a moderation question, so I don't know who has comfort answering it, but I know that we've had to think about it, so maybe you have as well, which is, how do you enforce the code of conduct on IARC, but maybe there's other examples where people can change nicknames and IPs and generally kind of get around the discipline of behavior? Have you seen that or had to deal with that in the past?
It's a very good question, and something that the Drupal community needs to think about right now, actually.
Yeah, we actually had in Outreachy, we had an incident where someone was forging emails from their mentor telling other applicants to withdraw. So this is something I have to think about as well. But in this case, it was a web form that someone could fill out to send a forged email. And so there's really no traceability there. And I feel like even if you have a better tool, something where you can block people, like instead of IRC, if you had something like ZooLp or Discourse, you could enforce a ban on a user. People can still make new accounts. So there's always going to be this problem of people faking accounts or making new accounts. Yeah, it's just a difficult one to deal with.
When I was at GitHub, one of the exercises that I led, I was on the community and safety team, and personas are a regular sort of mechanism that UX designers use to understand populations of users. They will say, this group of people with this sort of set of goals, we're going to call all of them Melissa, and so on, and break the population up that way. An experiment that I tried with the group was taking bad actors and also developing personas for them. So you have people who are just rude. You have people who are accidentally causing problems. You have trolls. There's a wide range of people with different motivations that may result in bad behavior. And I think understanding the profiles of those different people, and with UX, you want to reduce the friction for the people who share a common goal. And with enforcing a code of conduct or preventing bad actors from damaging your community, you want to do the opposite. You want to look for ways to make it as high friction as possible, because that friction will deter certain people from doing damage to the community. And I think it's important to think of it in those terms, like, how can we make this as difficult and unrewarding as possible?
I mean, I didn't realize until actually today how trivially easy it is to impersonate somebody else on Slack. It's just so, names are case sensitive. Yeah. Just something as simple as that, and anyone can create a Slack account. I know that we're setting up OAuth on Drupal.org. That's one of the things that's taking place at the moment, so that we can at least have accounts, not necessarily on Slack because we can't afford it, but the ability for camps, etc., to be able to reflect actual identity when people log in different places, and know that it is actually at least the Drupal.org account that people think it is. Whether that's actually a real physical person is another matter entirely.
Sorry, someone's going to speak. I just moved to another question. Did anyone else have anything on that really tough problem that we all are often trying to solve? Okay. I know that we've in IRC sometimes think about moving to other channels, but the hard thing to know when you're selecting tools is how easy is that tool to then do the same thing, like to move a community off IRC and then go, let's go on Slack, and then for there to be some loophole that allows them to do that there would just be like, and so that's why I think Coraline, the creating friction is really interesting to investigate. I thought that's going to give me a lot to think about.
Yeah, creating friction can be valuable to avoid drive-bys. At the same time, we need to avoid creating so much friction that people who are trying to genuinely figure out how to contribute can't figure out how to get their questions answered about things like, how do I set up my development environment? How do I create my first pull request? Yeah. How do I edit this localization? That kind of thing.
I think this is also something where we as users of tools need to work with the communities developing those tools to try and figure out what kinds of friction could be inherent within the platform that is not inherent in our community. Because there are certainly going to be usage patterns that we can't see at the consumption level that they can see at the tool level that point to certain kinds of behavior. And that may be something that we can work with those communities not to name drop, but I know that Freenode is interested in talking about these kinds of issues with regards to its IRC platform. And they just have access to data that we don't.
There are a number of open source Slack-like platforms coming out, and I think it would be interesting if we were able to sort of give them feedback on what is an open source project we need to make moderation viable.
I think it's really important in the selection of tools too, to make sure that moderation is possible. Slack is omnipresent, and Slack has demonstrated a lack of interest in supporting people who don't pay for the platform. You can't block users. You can't mute. There are very few moderation features in Slack, and it's easy to use, and it's universally used, and is actually a really poor platform for people who have moderation needs.
It's not a platform for want of a better description, the likes of us. They're not interested in open source projects. Full stop. It's not their business model. It's okay. Exactly. They don't have to have us as a business model. They're allowed to have interest in other people, and that's fine. I completely support them. But for us to pretend that we're going to change somebody's business model just for our benefit is not going to happen. So yeah, we need to deal with that.
Right. Whereas I think maybe approaching someone like the ZooLp community, because I know that open source is their business model, and they do give, for example, free hosted accounts for open source communities. So they or other open source chat may be more open to how do we make better moderation tools. But I agree, Slack's kind of a black hole.
Yeah, working with tools teams seems like a huge opportunity. That's good to know about Freenode. I'm going to try and take one more question here, which is a really good one, like stepping back to think about what does it mean to introduce the idea of a code of conduct to a project which hasn't thought about it much before. And this is from Emmanuel. I hope I'm not saying your name too Canadianly. Basically, and they elaborated on the pad here, like, is it co-organizers, project partners, or do you mostly start with those who already care? Like, what does the introduction look like?
I can talk some about one of the advice clients that I have, the symphony community. So basically, they came to me. It was really one person who was really interested in getting code of conduct working in their community. And my first reaction to them was like, you can't do this all on your own. You need to find other champions who can take on different aspects of not just code of conduct, but how do you make the community more inclusive? And so I think he put together a group of maybe like 5 to 8 people to start with to really get going. And like he was in a place to approach core members to say, what if we adopted this code of conduct? And they actually did, I believe, a modified version of the contributor covenant.
That's correct.
Yeah. And so basically it took someone who was already integrated into the community, who knew the core team, who could make those connections and advocate for that and find the champions. And I think that if you're not a part of that core team of the project, it's much harder to do so.
I've seen lots of failed attempts to adopt a comprehensive code of conduct because the maintainers have treated their project as a democracy. And I think you have to have champions, to your point, Sage. You have to have people who are not asking the question, do we need a code of conduct, but rather, what kind of code of conduct do we want and how are we going to enforce it?
So did that answer your question to the person who asked that? Or was there any other specific? And you can follow up in the Etherpad afterwards. A lot of people we've noticed to be watching this call afterwards, so I'll also check back for questions. And Larysa's added some text there too. Yep. Okay. Thanks. So I think 6 minutes. I think we had still one more question, which I'll try and get to. And this has been a good conversation. No. have lost my place in the Etherpad. Okay, so the last question for sure is, if someone is found disobeying the code of conduct, and so, we say violating, like, the unacceptable behaviors, should and after how much time they be allowed to join back to the community? What is I guess this is like about banning people and onboarding them. Is that a thing? And when is it a thing?
I think that the answer is it really depends. I mean, if the reason that they got banned is that the community thought that there was a threat to someone's physical or mental health or safety, they may not come back. The community may make a decision that this is not a person that adds to the safety of our community. If it's something like someone needed to take a break because they were, being abrasive to newcomers or something like that, then maybe it's shorter. But it really depends on the situation, I think.
Yeah.
I think that that highlights a common fear that COC detractors have about overreach. And they're like, oh, if I do one wrong thing, I'm going to be banned permanently. And that comes down to a matter of trusting the project leadership to make decisions that are contextually appropriate and that are proportional to the kind of violation that happened. And I would argue that if you don't already trust the project leadership to be reasonable in enforcement, you have no business contributing to that project anyway.
And just to echo, I think it's very important that people have the ability to, quote unquote, come in from the cold. But yeah, it has to be relative to what occurred. One of the things, in a related note to what Coraline was saying, one of the things that I've been saying to some folks as we work on our code of conduct is, it is called a code of conduct. And in some ways that is regrettable because the word code has very specific meaning to a lot of people. But it is not an algorithmically executed thing. It is something that is executed by actual humans with actual context and an actual situation. So do not read this as a black and white, true, false executed thing that causes you to misspeak. You misused a pronoun by accident, and now you are banned forever from the internet. That is not how the world is going to work. And that may be an example that, if taken to an extreme, we could come up with someone who misuses pronouns continuously and we ban them from the internet forever. But I think that it's very important that we keep driving home that message of, there are people who you know and trust, at least tangentially within your community, who are doing this work.
The one thing that we've done, we have a consequence ladder, which we actually adopted, I think, from a few remixes of something similar, where if we do, there's different types of bans. There's like the break, which I think someone mentioned, and then there's temporary imposed ban and permanent ban. And so if we have the type of ban or break that implies that you can come back, we have what's called an onboarding, a CPG, which is what we call our code of conduct onboarding. And so the steps for onboarding will be collaboratively created with the project. So we'll talk to, say, someone, the project where these things happened. What tools should this person have access to? Which people should they stay away from? Or that's like, I'm making this up a little bit, and then we will onboard them with those kind of rules for engagement, but make it like a positive tone as far as like, this is where you can go. We wish you luck. But this is, and then we point at the next level of the consequence ladder, which might be a permanent ban if this happens next. So we try and set them up for success, make sure the project feels comfortable, the people, and that they feel like they can move forward, knowing what the consequences are for further. So that's how we're doing it right now, and it seems to be fairly positive so far.
And also, when people come back after a timeout or a temporary ban, and we can facilitate them back into that community in a managed way, as you've described, we have to remember that's a really positive thing. This is somebody who has learned a lesson, and they will always have that lesson with them. And we need to kind of encourage that to a degree, I think, and not kind of permanently mark someone as horribly toxic. When people go to prison in real life, when they come out, we need to give them opportunity. We need to give them employment. We need to do all these things that bring someone back into the real community, the real world community in a positive way. Otherwise, yes, they'll continue to do it. Absolutely, we need to encourage people when they have had that time out, shall we say.
I largely agree with that, but I think there are also people who are going to be toxic and who are not going to learn, and they need to be identified as well. Repeat offenders, people who are not learning the lesson, those people do exist. And we need to remember
Absolutely.
that participating in open source is a privilege, not a right.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. But when somebody has done something once and they're coming back into the community, they have to be given the opportunity to not be a repeat offender.
Yeah, definitely.
They have to be given the opportunity.
Yeah, depending on and this is why it's always, we're speaking a bit abstractly, because there's definitely like one-offs that people can't come back. But yeah, I think So I'm going to stop. I'm just going to thank you all for being part of this amazing hour of insights and discussion. I'm going to stop the stream and